All right. Well, it is the 6 o'clock hour, so I think that we can go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
So with that, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us this evening for this is the 10th session of the Journey Down the Clackamas Conference. And it's my pleasure to get to do my first stint at the moderating chair. I'm Glenn Ahrens, your OSU Extension Forester. I cover Clackamas, Marion, and Hood River counties, and I have a background in forest ecology and a particular fascination with rivers, streams, and riparian forests and fish. Joining me tonight, we have Gail Shalom, who's the chair of the Clackamas River Basin Council now, and she's also our technical wizard and kind of helping with the background and working things in the chat, although she revealed that she has to learn to use the laptop mouse to do all that. So I bet your fingers will get faster as we go through the night. Before we get into the program, I need to cover a few items. And first, it's my pleasure to talk about the Clackamas River Basin Council celebrating their 25th anniversary. So 25 years since founding in 1996. CRBC has worked as a non-governmental group of stakeholders to protect and improve the Clackamas River Basin and its tributaries. Their mission is to foster partnerships for clean water, to improve fish and wildlife habitat, quality of life for all who live, work, and recreate in the Clackamas River Watershed. So on behalf of the council, I'd like to thank our sponsors for tonight as well. Gold sponsor is Clackamas Water Environment Services, or WES. We also want to thank our bronze sponsors, the Clackamas River Water Providers and the Geological Society of the Oregon Country. Thanks also to the many individuals who've donated to support the conference. We continue to seek additional donations, which are tax deductible. The Clackamas River Basin has been occupied by Native peoples for millennia. It is originally the territory of the Clackamas, Chinook, Molalla, and Kalapuya, and other peoples, and it is currently recognized as lands of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, and belongs to other Native peoples who may not be federally recognized. We thank those who came before us for their stewardship of these lands and waters, and those who continue to steward them now and in the future. So we're gathered for this journey down the Clackamas to learn in-depth information about the basin and its connections to Oregon as a whole, and to connect with each other so that we can support our mutual efforts to protect and improve the Clackamas River and its tributaries, and to have some educational fun. CRBC is partnering with the Environmental Learning Center at Clackamas Community College. Workshop attendees will receive Clackamas Community College continuing education credits and can also request a signed certificate of completion for each session. So if you would like a certificate of completion, you can add your contact information to our Journey Down the Clackamas Conference Networking Google Sheet. And so that link is in the chat. And you can put in that sheet that you'd like to get a certificate, enter that in the column G, and we'll forward your contact information to the community college so you can get that. I'd also like to share a few ground rules before I introduce our guests. Please keep your microphones on mute unless invited to participate. You can also keep your cameras off if you like. That will help us save bandwidth for our presenters. It will also reduce the carbon footprint of our meeting. We will have 4 presenters this evening, and they'll have a brief Q&A after each presentation and also at the end. It would be good if you could type your questions in the chat, and then we can select the questions and manage them from there. But you can also feel free to send direct chats to friends that you're seeing in the participants list and talking amongst yourselves in the background. So now we will start our presentations for the evening. Remember to put your questions in the chat and keep yourself muted, and we'll answer questions after each presentation. So we have 4 speakers, as I said. Due to the amount of the material tonight, the webinar will extend till about 7:40, and there will be also time for questions afterwards. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our 4 presenters tonight. Of course, then you'll meet them as they go in turn. First, I'd introduce Dr. Upekala Wijeratne, a vegetation ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service, who has recently joined the Northwest Oregon Area Ecology Group out of Sandy. And her interests include understory responses to fire, riparian and special habitat restoration, and effects of climate change on habitat, alpine vegetation, etc. And so welcome, she'll be starting us off. Also, one of our main presenters is Dr. Steve Acker. He's a vegetation ecologist with over 30 years of experience working for federal agencies and academic institutions in the Pacific Northwest. His work has focused on deadwood as a component of forest habitats, landscape patterns of riparian vegetation, tree mortality and biomass accumulation in old growth forests, and effects of fire on vegetation and vegetation restoration. We also have Dr. Holly Kearns, a plant pathologist with U.S. Forest Service Forest Health Protection, also out of the Sandy office, assisting natural resource and land managers with the management of both invasive and native pathogens in forest ecosystems. She's worked for state and federal agencies for 25 years in the Pacific Northwest and the Central and Northern Rocky Mountains. And finally, we also have Dr. John Kim. He is an ecological modeler with the Western Wildland Environmental Threat Assessment Center and with the Pacific Northwest Research Station with the Forest Service. He studies climate change impacts on vegetation using dynamic global vegetation models. So with that, this is a great lineup of speakers. I'm really excited to hear your presentations tonight. So I'd like to welcome Peck, Steve, Holly, and John as they present about the forests of the Clackamas River Basin. So go ahead, Peck, and start your presentation.
Thank you, Glenn, for that introduction. So what I'll be doing is just introducing the general theme for today, and also the presenters. Can you tell me if you can see that? Oh, I think I'm in.
Yes.
Yeah, I can see it. And you would want to start your slideshow.
Yeah, if it will. There we go. Okay, so
that's good.
Like I said, I'm just going to do a real brief introduction and then let the others take on the meat of the presentations today. So I believe today is our first forestry presentation, and we'll be talking about the historic, current, and future tree species distributions, forest types, and forest stressors within the basin. First, I wanted to introduce all of us. You got a nice little background of each of us and our education, where we came from and what our interests are. But as we were getting together, we realized that we actually represent 3 of the deputy areas within the Forest Service. I think many people, when they think of the Forest Service, mostly think of the National Forest System, but there's actually 2 other main ones: research and development and state and private forestry. And this international programs actually used to be its own deputy area as well, but then it recently got moved, downsized, and then moved directly under the Office of the Chief. So you'll be hearing from John, who is with the research and development. Steve Acker is a retired area ecologist, and then I came in right after he retired about a year ago. And we're both area ecologists under the National Forest System, and this is what most people are familiar with. It's got the district rangers, the forest supervisors, the firefighters, all the specialists, and the rec staff. So those are probably the people that you mostly interact with when you think of Forest Service. And then we've got Holly, who is in the state and private forestry deputy area. And I just wanted to take a few moments here and go into the programs. So we're also within those deputy areas. We are within specific programs. And John is with WETAC, which was created in 2005 to predict and detect, assess environmental threats to Western wildlands. They've got 4 focus areas: wildfire risk, fuels management, landscape assessment, environmental change, invasives. And their goal is to inform policy and support management of environmental threats. I did provide, excuse me, a website for all of our programs, since this is going to be recorded. If you have any interest in going to and learning more about our specific programs, you're welcome to go visit the websites. And then Steve and I are with the Pacific Northwest Region Area Ecology Program. And this program was started in the late 70s, primarily to get a handle on the productivity of our forest and rangelands. And mostly that was by way of producing plant association guides and and coming up with the plant associations. And Steve will get into that a little bit later in the talk. We're organized in 6 areas, and each area is composed of 2 to 3 forests. And each area usually has 2 to 3 ecologists that work together in teams. And Steve and I belong to the Northwest Oregon Ecology Program. So we cover the Mount Hood, the Willamette, the Siuslaw, and actually the Columbia River Gorge as well, the National Scenic Area. And we also have a formal charter with the Salem and Eugene BLM. So we do trainings for them, and we do some assessments and data collection, that sort of thing, back and forth with the BLM as well. But primarily, we're a little unusual in this area in that we have that charter. Primarily, the ecologists only work on Forest Service lands. And our main roles are to provide ecological information. We do landscape assessments, come up with tools and methods to support planning, technology transfer, meaning kind of the liaison between the research, the science, and management. We do a lot of monitoring and mentoring within the Forest Service. And then Holly is with the Forest Health Protection, FHP, with the Insect and Disease Service Centers. And they're a little bit different in that they actually deliver technical assistance to all federal forest landowners. And so whereas the ecologists only work on Forest Service lands, Holly actually works on all federal lands and does a number of things: insect and pathogen identification, survey monitoring, training also, technology development, invasive species, and so on. So just wanted to take this opportunity to introduce, I guess, the breadth of the things that the Forest Service does, more than just what I think people usually think of as the Forest Service. And with that, I will let Steve take it away.
Thank you, Peck. All right, and who's next? Is it Steve or is it John?
I believe it's me.
Oh, I think it's actually, yeah, sorry, it's John.
That's good. I appreciate that overview. Go ahead, John.
All right. Let me know if you're not seeing my shared screen.
We're actually seeing it in presenter mode, so we see your next slide as well.
Oh, bummer. Okay, let me fix that.
There you go.
All right. Thanks. Okay, so I will be talking about how forests have changed over the millennia and how they may look in the future, all condensed into just a couple tens of minutes, I guess. So it'll be a rather quick overview. I like this quote from a book that I read actually many years ago by E.C. Pailu, a Canadian ecologist, who says that we are now living in an unusual interval in an unusual age. And the unusual age is that this is the age of glaciation, where glaciations happen periodically. But that's not that's unusual for the life of the planet itself. And for much of the life of the planet, it was much warmer than that. And then within that glacial age, we are in an unusual interval in that we are between glaciations. So that sets the stage for kind of where we are right now, where the ice sheet, the glaciation has retreated, and we are in a warm period between glaciations. As the global temperature changes with glaciation in the past, trees have migrated with those changes in climate. And you can see some evidence for that. This is from a study by Bartling and others in 1998. You can look at fossilized pollen of different tree taxa to see how they migrated in the past. And so you're seeing multiple panels here. On the left side, you've got spruce species, and then on the right side, Douglas fir. And along the top row there are fossil pollen evidence. And so little dots basically show you how they migrated from 21,000 years ago on the left side to 11,000 years ago in the middle. And then on the right side is the present. And you can see the green dots where the pollen, where there were an abundance of pollen moving northward as the glacier retreated. Along the bottom, you've got panels showing modeled climate space. And by that, what I mean is climate conditions that people have estimated to be well suited for spruce. So you can see in the very far bottom left that 21,000 years ago, much of the West Coast was thought to have had a suitable climate space for spruce. And then 11,000 years ago, it expands very much northward to Canada and Alaska. And it's similar today. And then on the right side is the same story where the dots on the top panels show Douglas fir pollen evidence shifting northward as time progresses from 21,000 years ago to present. And then in the bottom panels, the climate space shifting upward with warming. Another way to document some of the past changes is to take these long, slender cores out of bogs and certain types of ponds and lakes where sediments are well preserved and layered. And what people do is they analyze the core slice by slice for both how old they are using radiocarbon dating methods and how much charcoal each slice contains. And then they can kind of reconstruct how much fire there may have been over time. So in oh shoot, I'm just realizing that I did not I did not credit this paper. I apologize for that. But in the middle here, you see a red box where I outlined Little Lake, which the location of which you can see on the right side located map. It's not exactly here in the near Clackamas, but this is how this kind of science goes. Those cores, cannot be obtained from every desired location. You kind of find them opportunistically. So using this as kind of an indicator of how the regional fire environment may have been, what these authors show is that at the beginning of the Holocene, about 10,000 years ago, there was much more fire, and you can it's indicated by kind of the peak that peaks to the right in the red box. And then about 5,000 years ago, it declined somewhat, and then there's a little bump, and then it declines again, and it's much lower now than it has been at the beginning of the Holocene. There's also much work that has been done with looking at fossil Douglas fir evidence to show that the current range has expanded from what ecologists call climate refugia. And on the left side of this slide, you kind of see somewhat of a diagram of how a climate refugia might work as climate changes dramatically over the continent. So in the top line graph here with a little gray lump at the top, this is where Douglas fir or any tree species for that matter may have proliferated between glaciation. And then as the glacier pushes its range southward, and on the diagram it's the second row, the south would be represented by the left side. So the range is pushed left, pushed southward as the glacier expands. And then as the glacier retreats, the habitat expands back to where it used to be, but way on the left side is where the trees persist in what they call a refugia. This is where they, if you were to anthropomorphize the trees, they sort of found or sought refugia from the glaciation. So on the right side of the map, the purple parts are the current distribution of Douglas fir, and the blue parts are where scientists have modeled the prior habitat during glaciation. And the black arrows show which way they seem to have migrated after the glaciers retreated. Another pollen and charcoal study taken from Lake Oswego, which is not too far from Clackamas. In this study, it shows the black lines, or the black area that you see in the graph is the amount of charcoal that were collected by Lake Oswego over time. And in the x-axis, we have years. So it goes back about 3,300 years. And what this paper has shown is that around 1,200 years ago, along with a lot of archaeological evidence showing that people have established themselves as year-round and seasonal residents of Lake Oswego and the surrounding regions, fire activity greatly increased, and it persisted for many hundreds of years. And then around the time of European people arriving here, and many of the Native Americans perishing due to diseases and just replacement, the fire really died out, and then of course began the modern era of Forest Service fire suppression, which also kept the fire signal very suppressed. So that kind of brings us to, that kind of history brings us to the present. And going forward, here's kind of a picture of what we may be facing. The climate is already warming in the Pacific Northwest. This is the average temperature plotted using some gridded climate data for the Columbia River Gorge, Mount Hood, and the Willamette National Forest area combined. And you can see that there's been a definite increase in temperature in the last 100 years. One of the things that I do in my work is to take IPCC climate change scenario projections and then create future vegetation projections based on those climate projections. And this data here on the left side is one of the climate change scenarios. So this depicts a plausible future. It's not a prediction per se, but it's a plausible future. And this is a scenario called RCP 8.5. It's a scenario under which there is very high warming around the globe. And it's somewhat typical for many types of climate change studies to use this as a kind of a business as usual, some might even call worst case scenario study scenario. Under that scenario, climate changes, climate warms rapidly for the next 100 years. And then precipitation is, the story is a little bit varied depending on which global climate model you use to simulate. It may result in more precipitation. In some of the climate models, there's a little bit less precipitation, but overall, the consensus among the models is that the winters will be wetter and summers will be a little drier. And actually, I guess I went ahead a little bit. This graph here shows the black lines are on the left side. The black line is the annual temperature of present recent historical. And then the colored lines and the gray shading are the range of possibilities, plausible temperature changes in the future at the end of this century. And then on the right side is the precipitation projections. So as I said, in some of the models, the winters may be a little wetter, and in others, the winters are drier. In most models, the summers are somewhat drier. What does this mean for forests? What are the ramifications? We've done some calculations using these climate change scenarios to see how the growing season length may change in the Columbia River Gorge, Mount Hood, and Willamette National Forest region. And the projected climate change impacts are very differently depending on what elevation you're looking at. So for higher elevations on the left side, what we see, these different colored lines are results from different global climate models based on different climate models. So at higher elevations, we think it's plausible for the growing season to grow by several months. And then at the lower elevations, the growing season length, it's already quite warm. Doesn't freeze for many months of the year, so it may not change very much. But in terms of climatic water deficit, the lower elevations is projected to experience quite a bit of climatic water deficit. And climatic water deficit, what that represents is the difference between the amount of energy in the air to evaporate and transpire the water that is available. So where there is much more energy than there is available water from the precipitation, then there is a deficit. Also, according to our calculations under RCP 8.5, the high warming scenario, the average temperature in the Pacific Northwest is projected to depart by around year 2050 or so. And by depart, what we mean is not just to set a record, just one time, but leave the historical range of variability, the last 100 years worth of range, permanently, so that by year 2051, what the data is saying is that the average temperature for year 2051 is such that it was never found in the last 100 years. So to explore what these the future climate scenarios may do to vegetation, one of the things I do is to run a vegetation model. It's called the Dynamic Global Vegetation Model. It's called MC2. It simulates basically all the ecosystem function and fluxes using climate data as drivers. It simulates biogeography, which is, where do things grow? It simulates fire currents, and it simulates biogeochemistry, how plants grow based on its environment. And then, so we run this model on a monthly time step, and then for a given study area, we could output projections of what the hydrology ramifications might be, how much carbon might be stored, and what the vegetation types might be, and what the fire activity might be. We've done this actually for many different national forests and groups of them in the Pacific Northwest, and it's an interdisciplinary process where we involve experts from different areas to make sure that our models are calibrated and calibrated well with the best available data, and that the analysis that we pull out are relevant. So we've done that with the Columbia River Gorge and Willamette National Forest and Mount Hood National Forest. And this includes much of the Clackamas River Watershed. So I just wanted to share with you some of the results from that. So on the left side, what we've done is we've taken the model outputs. We've driven the model with 28 different global climate models into the future. And then we looked at the output and asked ourselves, how many of those 28 different simulations result in vegetation type changing? And vegetation type is somewhat of a coarse grouping of forest species and other plant types. And so on the left side, what this exercise shows is that right around Mount Hood and a little bit to the southeast, that's where a very high number, I believe 23 to 28 of the simulations show that by the end of the century, the vegetation type will change. And then much of the, I guess it's kind of a lavender purple color that you see is low. So, according to this simulation exercise, much of the mid to lower elevation areas will stay stable. But then, there are much lower areas where they are projected to change. We also looked at what are some of the driving factors. And these are 5 different panels from 5 different simulations that are driven by different global climate models. The outline of the study area is a little bit tough to tell, but hopefully you can see Mount Hood as a little bit of a dot there right next to the word Portland. But what the simulations are saying is that with warming climates, especially under this scenario, which is very much a warmer climate, the net primary productivity is projected to increase significantly. In fact, the dark green is 100%. So that's quite a bit. In terms of where things will be, what types of plants will be where. Again, this is for the similar study area. Again, if you could kind of locate Mount Hood as that little dot of a crater, I guess on this map is a little bit to the bottom and right of the word Portland. So these different colors represent different types of vegetation that the model simulates. And the main story here is that if you compare the top left, which is the historical picture, with the bottom picture, bottom map, which is the end of the century, you see that this kind of light blue, teal blue disappears. That's the alpine, what the model predicts to be the alpine tundra, and that just completely disappears. And then at the lower elevations, you kind of have this bright pink vegetation coming in that represents subtropical mixed forest. And that's kind of a coarse grouping, but essentially what that means is that species that are associated with year-round, non-freezing temperatures, likely broadleaved, maybe oak species are likely to proliferate along the lower portions of the study area, as well as some parts near Portland. We've also looked at what the simulated fire dynamics are, from these set of simulation experiments. And these set of graphs show fire return interval. So that is, how long does it, what is the average interval between fires? And we've plotted different types of vegetation in each panel. And the lines represent going from historical on the left to mid-century in the middle of the panel, and then to the end of the century on the right side. So, the lines are fairly coarse, and these are modeling experiments. So, we don't have super precise fire intervals that that we could extract, but what they show is that fire return intervals for all these different vegetation types are projected to decrease by mid-century and even further by end century. So the moist coniferous forest, which is the bottom left panel, the fire interval, according to some of the GCMs, go from having these long intervals somewhere between like 300 to 500 years to coming to more like 250, and then going even lower. There's one GCM under which the interval decreases by mid-century, but then increases again. I am not sure exactly about why that's happening. It may have to do with a type conversion where the pixels associated with that type of forest may convert from one type of vegetation to another, which dramatically changes the fire return. Finally, I want to highlight this one other really cool study that was done by Andy McAvoy. He's actually currently a research fellow working with me, but he did this study with other researchers at PSU before he joined my group. In this study, he and his group used a very fine resolution, relatively fine resolution fire model called FSIM to simulate fire regimes in the Clackamas River Watershed for the historical period, for the recent historical, and then, which is the baseline here, and then going into the mid-century. And so in the middle map here, where it says baseline, that shows the average annual burn probability. And then in the bottom two maps, the ones that are labeled HadGem and MyRock Chem, these are GCM names. This shows the simulated future burn probability for the watershed. So what you can see is, a lot more, a lot of the kind of the salmon orange color converting to red at the higher elevations. And what that means is going from having a burn probability of 0.005, which is about, that's about 1 in 200, right? And then that is going up to 0.0147. So I believe that's about 1 in 68. So that's a huge increase in fire probability for the higher elevation portions of the watershed. You can read more about it if you like. The paper is in the journal called Fire. It was published in 2020. All right, that's the end of my story, and I believe we're going to have a few questions, and then I guess I get to pass the baton to Steve.
Yeah. So are there questions for John? You can put them in the chat, or at this point, if you have a question and you just want to speak it, that would be acceptable as well. I don't see any in the chat at this time.
There was one question for Peck in the chat, which she answered also in the chat. So we have that. Well, if nobody else has a question, I do. I was wondering, given the climate change scenarios and what we know about what the different species of trees can survive, I was wondering if John or anybody else might have specific recommendations for riparian species of trees we should be planting. The Clackamas River Basin Council and others do a lot of riparian planting. And should we be looking at things that are native to Southern Oregon, or maybe some of the broad-leaved oaks you mentioned, or something else from that subtropical forest? Or do you have any recommendations?
I'm going to answer half of that and then hopefully pass the buck to maybe Steve or Peck. So my half of the answer is that it's an incredibly difficult question because of the uncertainty of the future. So even though I showed you many maps and charts showing this is a plausible future, it is only a scenario. We have no idea where we're going to land. It just depends what we as a global society wind up doing in terms of slowing down the warming. So to make that answer a little bit more concrete, what I would say is that we are all on a somewhat unintended journey from the Portland metro area to somewhere down to Sacramento in the next 100 years. If we go down an unmitigated path, then we'll wind up with summers at least that are very similar to Sacramento. So if that's where we wind up, then you might look at what species are adapted to that kind of a climate. But the problem is we don't know if we're going to go all the way down there, or we might just go to Ashland and stop. So I believe that, and this is a bit of a wonky answer, but I believe that the right answer is to diversify your portfolio so that you lose some, you win some, but you don't lose everything. But that's difficult to do, especially when you are making decisions for a small area. And in terms of global climate change, even Clackamas River Watershed is a small area. So anyway, let me pass the buck to Steve and Peck and see if they can talk more specifically about some species.
Well, I would tend to echo really what John said. I know that there's a lot of work going on to define source areas that are going to be most useful for different plant species under different future climate scenarios. And I think a lot of the folks associated with the genetics group and the Forest Service have been working on that. My understanding of that work is it's more, for a little broader template for upland areas, which I think are probably going to be a little bit of easier to address than riparian areas because they are small and there's so much fine-grained heterogeneity in terms of the environment. So I'm not sure that I can be a lot more definitive than John was. I think he's on the right track. I mean, my personal professional opinion is that maintaining or emphasizing the genetic diversity within local populations is probably a good bed hedging strategy, because there has been a lot of variation in the past, and there should be, in these populations that are here now of plants, there should be a certain amount of variability present. So at least maintaining some of that possibility for the different genotypes that might be already around to come to the fore. That doesn't really help you with what you want pay somebody to propagate with the intention of putting it in the ground in a particular riparian area. But I don't know if Peck has any other thoughts, or Holly or Glenn.
Pretty much the same. I mean, I don't think anybody's ready to, move things from Southern Oregon to up here yet. It's really just making sure that some of those drier, more tolerant, drought tolerant species are in the mix.
Thank you.
And I actually like what Steve said about the heterogeneity of genetic variation within a population. If there's any way of getting at that, pretty good. I like that.
Yes, and we're staying tuned to see what the genetics groups that focus on the individual species and their particular genetic variation they have, Douglas fir being a fairly much of a specialist, so that we identify very different families of Doug fir as you move, geographically from California up to British Columbia, that they're working on that. So stay tuned. Are there any other questions for John at this point? I think with that, why don't we go ahead and pass the baton, and thank you, John. And the panel will be here at the end as well. So we might do more group discussion too.
Okay, well, looks like I thought I got back to my first slide, but evidently I didn't. Try to rectify that. Okay, well, thanks, John and Glenn and Peck. I'm going to talk about some information that maybe is a little bit more specific in terms of time and place, but if we really want to understand vegetation, we need to grapple with those long spans of time and large geographic scopes that John did such a great job of
Hey, Steve.
describing.
Steve, sorry,
Yeah.
could you go into, are you presenting? Because I can see your sidebar. I don't know that you're presenting.
Okay. Let me go back here.
Maybe it got stuck on the previous. There we
There
go.
it is.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it didn't catch up with what I was doing. So, okay, great. Thanks, Peck. Yeah, so we want to talk a little bit about the vegetation ecology of the Clackamas River Basin. And as Peck mentioned, we're both have had this position of the area ecologist stationed at Mount Hood National Forest. And so, we have a lot of really interesting resources in terms of understanding this particular area. So here's just one example of that, a historic view, almost 100 years ago in the summertime, showing a fair amount of variability in the structure of the vegetation, gives you some idea that there might have been some disturbances going on, whether those were fire or various other things. So I want to touch on a few different subjects, talk about ecoregions as a way to synthesize some important information about the environment. John mentioned fire regimes. I'm going to talk about our current understanding, based on the kind of evidence that he was discussing, how things have looked in the last couple centuries or so. Talk a little bit about ownership as one of the things that drives some of the important patterns. And then I'll actually talk a little bit about vegetation. So I'm going to talk about potential vegetation and why we care about that, and talk mostly about forest, but need to highlight a little bit about the non-forest because it's really a critical part of the diversity of our landscapes. And then talk about the current vegetation, both the living component and the really important dead aspects of the vegetation, and finish up with one particular species that I find really interesting that illustrates some of the key questions that are helpful for us in trying to understand the vegetation patterns that are present now and what might go on in the future, and what, as stewards, we might want to be thinking about. So I think it was evident all through John's talk that as vegetation ecologists, we spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about climate. So plants really depend on the availability of moisture, and temperature has a big role in that. So if we look at the global scale, we can see these major differences in vegetation structure, and we can relate that pretty directly to climatic patterns across the globe. And that's also true at a finer scale. One thing that happens when we move our focus in a little bit is that we tend to want to bring in other aspects of the environment to understand what kinds of conditions plants are experiencing and what might be appropriate in terms of management of the land and the vegetation. So the Environmental Protection Agency took the lead on developing a framework that a lot of people have used over the years, and this goes under the name of ecoregions. There are different levels, sort of a hierarchy of ecoregions. Here are the ecoregions at level 3 for Oregon and Washington, and these are areas that have some broad types of similarity, starting with the climate, but also in geology, and then the resultant soils, the vegetation, and all of these things add up to giving us some insights into how we might manage the landscape sustainably. So you can see these broad areas are probably pretty familiar to most of us. But, the Clackamas River Basin actually is primarily in this Cascades, the purple ecoregion, and some of it also in the Willamette Valley. So if we look directly at the Clackamas River Basin, as I said, there's two facets of this ecoregion 3, which is the Willamette Valley. One called Prairie Terraces, the other one Valley Foothills. And then there are 3 facets of the Cascades ecoregion: the Western Cascade lowlands and valleys, and the Western Cascades montane highlands. So they make up, they're the 2 largest parts of the basin. And then there's also this Cascade Crest montane forest, which is about 1/5 of the basin. And in a very quick overview, there are some really important differences with respect to geology and climate between these 5 different portions of the basin. So going from the lowest elevation, the prairie terraces, these are where a lot of sediments, whether they result from rivers or glacial activity, where those things have collected, the fairly low precipitation, at least in our context, 40 to 50 inches a year. And as John mentioned, a very long growing season. So, very close to good conditions for plant growth the entire year. And not a tremendous amount of freezing temperatures, at least over the historic period. The valley foothills, we're getting into some more, a little bit more relief, and some of the bedrock of the volcanic origin or sandstone, fairly similar climate. And then getting up into the Cascades, we get into, for both the Western Cascade lowlands and highlands, we're talking about the older part of the Cascade Range that's some 20 to 30 million years old, and the results of these volcanic processes, mostly these lava flows and these flows of very superheated material that welded together, the breccias, those kinds of things. Going up in elevation, and so the prevailing winds are bringing the moisture-laden clouds and more higher annual precipitation, and also consequently with that greater elevation, cooler temperatures, shorter growing season, more tendency for cool weather, especially in the wintertime. And then all the way up at the crest, we're into the younger portion of the Cascade Range, where there's a greater diversity of volcanic processes and also glacial processes that have formed the landscape. A little bit less of an annual precipitation, but a much shorter growing season, and a lot of very cool temperatures, below freezing temperatures in the winter, so that a good portion of the precipitation falls as snow. So, that's a really quick overview of how we think about how we synthesize a lot of these aspects of the physical environment. And that's what we tend to think of first when we try to understand vegetation patterns. There are a lot of other pieces to the puzzle that are also incredibly important. John talked about how species in North America and other places that have had major climatic changes that have moved over the millennia. And so that's what the second one is about. All sorts of reasons that species that might be able to grow in a place aren't there. So the vegetation can only be made up of the species that are close enough for a seed or a spore or some other reproductive part of a plant to make it to that location. And disturbance is going to remove a lot of plants, individual plants. It's going to create conditions for other ones to become established and set that whole process going. So we know that that's very important. And there are a host of other biological processes that are critical as well. Some of those promote growth of different species. We know that many of the plants that we see on our landscape absolutely have to grow in connection with some fungal species. They have, mutually beneficial relationships. There are other kinds of biological interactions that can remove different species or kill individuals that are there. Holly will be talking about a number of those. So, so again, there are quite a number of pieces to this puzzle. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about disturbance. We know that the forests in our part of the world have experienced fire repeatedly. In what we consider, I guess, to be the relevant past. As John was saying, more or less the Holocene, the last 10,000 years or so. And in the last few centuries, based on pollen evidence and a variety of other sources of information, we've been able to put together an idealized view of the different patterns of fire that we expect to have shaped the landscape over time. And so this is actually work that was part of a synthesis of the scientific information that's come out since the adoption of the Northwest Forest Plan in the 1990s, and all the work that's gone on since then to build on the ideas that underpin that planning effort. So we recognize 4 categories of fire occurrence in our part of the Pacific Northwest that range in terms of how frequently fire would have expected to occur. So this very infrequent regime, and that would have had mostly been characterized by fire that destroyed or killed most of the trees and occurred in very large patches. So that's the black color. And then, fire decreasing increasing in frequency, so decreasing in return interval, as John mentioned, and then varying in its effects. So different areas experience fire more frequently, they tended to have fire that was in smaller patches and also killed fewer individuals. So we refer to that as being lower severity fire. And particularly as we get over onto the east slope of the Cascades or down into the Southwest Oregon, there's this very frequent fire regime where maybe between 5 and 25 years we might have expected fire, and consequently there were very few mature trees that would have been killed by fire under those circumstances. For the Clackamas River Basin, 2 of these types of fire characterize most of the area. So a little bit over half would have been in this least frequent regime, where it would be centuries most likely between fires, and in a lot of cases, most trees would have been killed within the boundaries of those types of fires. And then about a third of the area would have been in a little more frequent fire, where we'd have a mixture of effects. There'd be places where fire would run through, remove a lot of the plants on the forest floor, probably young trees, that sort of thing. But a lot of the adult trees, a lot of the mature trees would have survived. And then, very small amount of a more frequent fire regime within the basin. So, things certainly are changing, and as climate changes, we expect fire occurrence to change. But understanding where we've been is still useful. It's important context. The basic behavior, the occurrence of fire is still going to respond to these 3 legs of the fire triangle. The topography is not going to change very much. The weather certainly is changing in response to climate change. And then, so we need to think about those things. And, even in the absence of climate change, of course, weather is variable and we can have all kinds of extreme events. This fuels piece is possibly the one that we as humans have the most direct effect on. And so that's something to keep in mind, that's perhaps one that at least in the short term, that we have the most influence over. So that leads me to just briefly sketch out patterns of ownership. This is, really the broad brush picture that, of some of the major categories of ownership, with the Forest Service constituting about 2/3 of the basin, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Land Management also having a portion, and about 1/4 of the basin being in private ownership. It sort of gets you the first step towards understanding what kinds of management might have been going on in the past and what might happen in the future. Of course, within the Forest Service lands, there's a whole host of different management objectives for different areas, and private owners have an equally diverse set of motivations and needs for the land that they manage. So this wouldn't get you all the way to having an understanding of how fuels might be managed in the future, or how road access might affect our ability to suppress fire, or for that matter, for people to intentionally or unintentionally cause fire. But it's the first step, as I say, in understanding a little bit about how we interact with, especially with that fuels part of the fire triangle. So having talked a bit about the environment and some of the important disturbances, I do want to actually talk about vegetation for a bit. Peck mentioned that the ecology program was initiated to look at potential vegetation as a way to help us fine tune our management, really, of the national forest system. And so I need to talk about potential vegetation and what it is and why we care about it. So the definition of it is that it's a construct, an idea, the vegetation that would exist on a site over a long period of time under the current environmental conditions, but in the absence of disturbance. So it's hypothetical, but the reason we care about it is that the plant species that come to occupy a site over a long period of time without disturbance tend to be a better represent that particular location than plants that are there early on. So, species like red alder, for example, or Douglas fir, they tend to come in places that have been recently disturbed, and they tend to occur in lots of different places. So you don't really know a tremendous amount about the environment if you just simply see a Douglas fir tree there. But something like western hemlock has a much narrower range of conditions and is much more indicative of what the environment might be able to support. It can tell us about really about all of the different kinds of vegetation that might be present over that whole sweep of time following disturbance. And we have come to use it as a basis for stratifying or organizing our analysis of the capability of the land for management. And also, when we carry out research, making sure that we're looking at areas that have comparable potential, so that we can really draw some valid conclusions from research. It's important to emphasize that it's a tool for us to help us think about the landscape, but it's not a prescription. So, by saying what the potential vegetation might be in a particular location, it's not a value judgment that's what we should strive to put there. It's a way to understand what the possibilities are. So at the fine scale, the ecology program in the Pacific Northwest has developed plant association information for all the national forests in Oregon and Washington. And this is based on a lot of collection of data from older forests, and then analysis of that data to see which plant species are pretty consistent in terms of the environmental conditions that they represent, and then use those to assign a name of a plant association. And so with that, that name, there's all sorts of information that we can retrieve. So we do know something about what a forest would look like if it was there, and if vegetation developed in the absence of disturbance for quite a long period of time. We know something about some of the site characteristics, what range of elevation, what soil types, what aspects, those kinds of things. How productive a site might be, whether we're interested in the growth rate of timber species, for example, or production of forage for particular wildlife species. That kind of information is retrievable. It also ties pretty clearly to the disturbance regime, so we get some idea about that. How vegetation will develop over time. I mentioned wildlife habitat, what might happen with different kinds of management or other kinds of disturbances, and so on. So it's really quite a useful system for organizing the information, the understanding that we have about the capability of the land. So here is a picture of the title page of the Plant Association Guide that pertains to the Clackamas River Basin and the rest of the Mount Hood National Forest, or at least west of the crest of the Cascades, I should say, and the Willamette National Forest and the Bureau of Land Management area that's on the west slope of the Cascades. And I put up this information about instructions for use, not because I expect people to have enough background to go out and start identifying plant associations, but to stress the scale that this information gets developed and applied. So you really need to go out on the ground and find some place that has fairly uniform, undisturbed conditions, and then record which plant species are present. And then you can use that to find your way through the Plant Association Guide to find the name that goes with that collection of tree, shrub, and herb species. So it's very fine-grained, and it actually turns out to be information that pertains to such fine aspects of the environment that it's very difficult to produce a map, which I'll get back to in just a minute. But here is what you would be able to take advantage of if you did go somewhere and were able to carry out that process of identifying the plant association. You would be able to see where that plant association occurred throughout this entire area on the west side of the Cascade Range. You get a lot of information about the environments where it occurs, the ranges of elevation, as I mentioned, some information about topography and soils, and such, and then a lot of information about the composition of the vegetation, information about the diversity, how many different plant species are likely to be found, the productivity. Again, here it's depicted in terms of the site index for Douglas fir, and then some other management considerations. What might happen with say a harvest, that removed most of the trees, or a fire, something like that. So in this case, there's a particular shrub species that wouldn't be present prior to a disturbance that could very well come to occupy the site afterwards. Could be a good thing if that shrub has some value for whatever your management objective is, and it might not be such a great thing if you're trying to get conifers reestablished. So those kinds of management implications. So really a tremendous amount of information, and as I said, pretty fine scaled and dependent on knowing a fair amount about a particular location that's of interest. We can think about potential vegetation at a broader spatial scale. So I briefly sketched out what an individual plant association, how that's recognized, and then we can relax our focus, or zoom out a little bit and talk about groups of those plant associations. And actually we can zoom out a little bit more and talk about a zone or a series where it's really the tree species that are helping us the most to understand the environment at that somewhat coarser scale. So at least for the Forest Service, as time has gone on, the need to understand potential vegetation at a fairly broad geographic scale has become really apparent. Certainly back to the 1990s with the Northwest Forest Plan, there have been a lot of needs to look at the whole forested area at a pretty broad scale to manage in an appropriate way for various kinds of biological and economic and social objectives. We need to undertake a lot of large scale analyses, and certainly thinking about the kinds of changes that John was describing, we do need to look at a regional scale to understand what's happening and what appropriate responses might be. So it's quite a need. and we really haven't had the tool to do that in a real consistent way until basically now. So a group of us from the Ecology program have been working for a number of years to develop a new map of potential natural vegetation that's at this appropriate scale, and building on all that work on individual national forests to develop the plant association information and how the species, tree and shrub and herb species can shed light on the environment in that way. So we took a consistent approach with these data, and I think we've developed something that definitely can be applied to these broad scale regional management questions and other kinds of analyses, and also can be scaled down to look at a somewhat finer scale. So so here's a view of that map with some of the detail fuzzed a little bit to make it a little bit more relevant to the Clackamas River Basin. But going from the coast, you can see the dark green, the Sitka spruce zone, and then quite a bit of western Oregon and Washington, and northeastern Washington is in the western hemlock zone. And going up in elevation, there's Pacific silver fir and mountain hemlock. And then down over the other side, other forest types, Douglas fir and grand fir, ponderosa pine, and quite a bit of the region actually has an environment that supports shrub or grass dominated vegetation. So a lot of this yellow that for the purposes of this depiction, I'm describing as non-forest vegetation. So there's quite a bit of that, and that's an important part of our environment as well. And I will mention, I'll say one other thing about non-forest vegetation in just a second. But just the last bullet point here is that we do have a lot of background, and the data associated with this work is available on the ecoshare.info website. So if we take a look at this new map of potential natural vegetation for the Clackamas River Basin, we mostly fall into one of these sort of more productive wetter forest types that are found in our part of the world. So little over 40% in the western hemlock zone, and then about a quarter in the Pacific silver fir zone, and then a little bit less in the mountain hemlock zone up there at the highest elevations. There's a little bit of drier forest, the Douglas fir and grand fir types. And then the other, there are places even within our generally wet and productive land that for one reason or another, whether it's thin soils or it could actually be standing water, it's wetlands, those kinds of things. There are places that do not have the potential to support forest, and those do represent hotspots of biological diversity, both for plants and insects and other animals. And that is actually a really active area of work for the ecology program and Northwest Oregon Ecology in particular. Doug Glavich, who's part of our team, has done a tremendous amount of work on that. I'm going to have to leave it there, but it's sort of a teaser that's a really fascinating part of our environment that we are working on to understand better. Okay, so I want to talk now about what's on the landscape as opposed to the idealized potential vegetation, what the current vegetation is. And in order, again, to have a comprehensive view of current vegetation, development of some pretty sophisticated data products were necessary. The people who have worked the most on this are from the research branch, the Pacific Northwest Research Station of the Forest Service, Janet Oman and David Bell, and also folks from Oregon State University, Matthew Gregory, and I believe that Heather and Roberts and Emily Henderson were probably associated with Oregon State University when they worked on this as well. So this collaboration is called the Landscape Ecology Modeling, Mapping, and Analysis Group, and they produced this gradient nearest neighbor method, and it's a way of filling in the missing data. This is, I think it's important to just briefly brush on how this information gets developed, because it is really a workhorse, at least for the Forest Service in Oregon and Washington. So it's a statistical process for basically filling in the blanks of what the current vegetation is. And so where we start the filling comes from actual data. So the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, as of almost 20 years ago now, I think, has been expanded to cover all lands. So the research side of the Forest Service, the National Forest System, a lot of state agencies and private landowners. It's a huge collaborative effort that generates a really amazing information resource. But it's a regular grid of plots, and they're all visited if possible. If they don't involve scaling a cliff or are visibly not forested on aerial photos, that sort of thing. But basically, a sample is taken every 10 years of all the forested vegetation. And then that's related to the rest of the landscape using a large group of independent sources of information. So climate, this gridded climate data John mentioned, that's one very important aspect of that, making that statistical link. There's also remote sensing data from the Landsat thematic mapper that looks at the reflection of light off the Earth's surface in different frequency bands. There's various things having to do with topography, elevation, and so forth, and then soils and geology. So these are independent things that don't have anything to do, that mean they're not measurements of the vegetation, they're measurements of predictors of the vegetation. And they are linked together in statistical models in a way that allow us to impute or fill in the blanks and paint a picture of the various kinds of characteristics of vegetation from wall to wall throughout the entire region. And I do want to mention that the Landsat remote sensing data is currently or recently has become available in the whole temporal series. So the data go back to the mid 1980s, and they've been collected by satellite in a pretty consistent way. So it's possible to collect a lot of information about changes in vegetation over that time. And we continue this gradient nearest neighbor data set continues to be updated. The most recent version uses satellite data up through 2017. So what I'm about to show you doesn't really bear directly on the Riverside fire, for example, but the potential to almost in real time capture those kinds of changes is a real strong point of this approach. So in terms of saying a little bit about the current vegetation, as I said, pre-2020 fires in the Clackamas River Basin, I want to take advantage of this one attribute that comes with the gradient nearest neighbor data set, which is abbreviated as VEG class for vegetation class. And I boiled that down from original longer set of categories into 6 different types. So there's sparse, which has less than 10% tree canopy cover, open, which is 10 to 39% canopy cover, broadleaf, which is at least 20% canopy cover, and the basal area is at least 65% in deciduous broadleaf tree species. And then the last 3 categories are, again, at least 40% tree cover, but less than 65% in the broadleaf deciduous tree species. And those range in the average size or the quadratic mean diameter of less than 10 inches or 25 centimeters. That's sapling and pole size. 10 to 20 inches or 25 to 50 centimeters for small and medium. And then large and giant are trees that are larger than that. And so, so based on this data that's current through 2017, we see a pretty speckled mix of different, mostly forested types throughout the basin. So, down at the downstream end, there's a certain amount of area that is not modeled. That's the non-forest. Again, this is area that, according to the data that get fed into the gradient nearest neighbor process, does not have the capacity to support forest. A lot of that is going to be agricultural land or developed areas. Then, there's a smattering of areas with fairly low cover in those sparse and open categories, just a little bit in the broadleaf type, and then the majority in those small, medium, or large and giant forest types. So obviously there's a lot more that we could do with this. And again, we would, to apply it to anything going forward, we're going to want to take into account any important disturbances such as the fires in 2020. But I think it gives you an idea of our ability to consistently represent the current vegetation. And of course, we can connect that to the potential vegetation and have an even greater understanding, I think. So I have to say something about dead wood. It's a really important part of the environment and something that I've spent a lot of time as a Forest Service employee working on. So it really supports a lot of the biological diversity and ecosystem processes that are on the landscape. Food and habitat for a whole host of different organisms on land and in aquatic systems. Again, I mentioned the ecosystem processes, nutrient cycling, moisture retention, soil development. I could add carbon sequestration, and it's quite diverse in terms of the kinds of objects that are out there on the landscape, whether we're talking about whether they're snags or logs or something else. And different species have different chemical and structural characteristics, and different sizes of trees lead to different types of structures, and also how long they've been in that dead state and how long they've been decaying lead to a host of different ecological functions. So I just really want to give a plug for our main source of information, which is a web-based tool that's called Decade, for the Decade Wood Advisor for managing snags, partially dead trees, and down wood for biodiversity in forests of Washington and Oregon. And I don't have time to apply, to show how this plays out for the Clackamas River Basin, but I think this banner really gives you a lot. Just all those photographs give you a good sense of the spectrum of values that are associated with the dead parts of the ecosystem. So Decade is it's a planning tool to help managers and other people who care about how the forests are managed understand how we interact and support biological diversity. There's a synthesis of wildlife literature, and again the vegetation inventory data that comes into play here. And there's the website. And if you want to understand more about all this accumulated information about dead wood, you might go to this "What is Decade" essay, or ecosystem processes related to wood decay. So that's just a rather than talking about it specifically for the Clackamas River Basin, I guess more of an ad for the dead wood part of the ecosystems. So I want to wrap up by talking about one particular tree species that I think is pretty interesting and is a helpful way to start thinking about really the tangible implications of some of these different processes, whether it's the ecoregions or how climate has changed in the past and may change in the future, or how long people have been on this landscape and have been doing various things here and carrying out their business and making a living. So Western larch is in the Clackamas River Basin. If you look in most references, you're going to find out that it's a important species of the drier forests in the Intermountain West. So from the east slope of the Cascades, the Blue Mountains, and the Rockies, from British Columbia to Montana, Idaho, Oregon. It comes in after disturbance and it lives for a long time. It has some characteristics, bark characteristics that allow it to survive fire, and certainly it's well adapted to disperse into burned areas and get established in those conditions, partly due to its light and wind dispersed seeds. It's a species that has been used by humans for quite a long time. A source of food and medicine for indigenous people in this part of North America. And just an interesting point is that it's a deciduous conifer. So if you're out looking around in the fall and you come into the contact with the Western larch, you will know it because it's going to be the only yellow conifer on the hillside. So there are a few recorded records up here from the Oregon Floor Project has pulled these together on their website. At the upper ends of the basin, and for me, it's really a great source of questions. How did it get here? Was there a big fire event in the last couple centuries, and And then not too long after that, some east winds blew it over from the east slope of the Cascades. It's possible that as an economic species for people who've been here for a long, long time, might they have moved it? I have no idea, but it seems possible. How long has it been here? Is it just something that was a sort of a unusual happenstance that it got into the Clackamas Basin and it's not destined to be here for very long, or is it the leading edge of some change that's on its way here? And these changes in our climate and in the fire regime, what might that mean for the presence of Western larch? And I think those questions, I mean, a species that is somewhat unusual and even being here and is a great way to start thinking about these questions. But I think they're really relevant to all of the vegetation that's out there on the landscape, and just maybe sort of an entryway to thinking about these really interesting and important questions. So I'm going to leave it there.
All right, thank you, Steve. Got any questions for Steve at this stage? I guess I would offer one. When you look at plant associations, which really help interpret the environment, and they definitely, climate is a big part of what drives what we think potential vegetation might be. How does that figure into looking at climate change and what John was talking about as far as species migration? And are ecologists trying to use plant associations and potential vegetation to kind of for more on the ground interpretation of shifts that might occur with climate change?
It's a great question. It is one that we get asked frequently, and I'm not sure that we have come up with a very good answer for that. I think understanding where we are now and that pattern of relationships between all these environmental factors and the potential vegetation, and then all the different stages that vegetation can develop through after disturbance, I think that's a really good starting point for understanding or for projecting what kinds of changes might be coming and how we might react to them. The idea of sort of having a shifting map of potential vegetation, I think that's a really important conversation to have. Maybe Peck has been involved in more conversations about that than I have. It's a tough one, I guess. I'm not sure that I have a really good answer.
I will say that I have not been in many conversations, but one of the things is that to think about is that these assemblages that we see right now may not stick together, right? So it's not like if there's shifts in vegetation, maybe at the series level, maybe at the bigger, longer lived species level, maybe we could predict those, but sort of the association itself at that fine scale, I'm not sure it would all move together.
Yeah, that gets pretty complicated. Well, another thing that jumped out at me was that mapper of the vegetation type. That's the application with the nearest neighbor and actually interpolating between the points of that survey to map it with a little help from a satellite image. That was pretty interesting, and and then that's accessible online if we wanted to look at some of that.
Yeah, I hope that I had a slide with the Lemma website. I'm certainly meant to.
I think you did, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, they have a tremendous amount of information on their website. And as I said, they have a new product that just was released within the last few months. And it's the most recent imagery that goes into that is 2017. And they have a form online to request data for different, like that veg class, or there are lots of other variables. You might just be interested in the density of conifers between a certain range of diameters or something like that. They have scores and scores of variables about vegetation that you can request. So it's yeah, and a really great description of how they develop the information and the caveats that need to go into it. I mean, it's based on Landsat remote sensing data, which has a footprint of about 100 feet on the side, don't go look at your favorite 100-foot by 100-foot area and expect that the data product is going to, be very illuminating. But if you're looking at a watershed or, some tens of thousands of acres, it's going to give you a really good idea of at least what was there before, at the time that the satellite flew over before the last fire or whatever it was. But as I say, we've done a lot of work to keep things current. And for some applications, and including some having to do with snags, we have the ability, the Forest Service has the ability to update that information in really short order. So we've already developed some data products associated with Decade that have to do with snags that take into account the fires of 2020.
Yes, that's one thing. We'll see a lot more snags on landscape.
Yeah.
For better or for worse. Well, are there any other questions in the chat here? I think I see the site is posted for the lemma that we were just discussing, so that's good. I think we should move on to Holly's talk. So thank you, Steve. That was a lot of new information for me, so I'm really excited to see that. And I'll be tapping into some of those resources. So let's move on. And Holly, let's talk about insects, diseases, stressors, and forest health.
Okay. See if I can get my screen shared here. Okay. So yeah, I'm hoping you see my presentation.
Yes, we see it.
Excellent. It's a little different setup than I'm accustomed to. Okay, well, thank you for hanging in there. We're going to switch things up and talk about the little things that play a big role in forest health within the Clackamas River Watershed. So these are the forest insects and diseases. Like I like to call it the cool stuff. So I wanted to start with a little bit of background. Most of the forest diseases and insects that cause disturbances in our forests are native organisms. So that means they have formed long associations with their hosts and have evolved together. These organisms operate at small, like think of the tree, even down to the individual needle, and sometimes even an individual stomate on a needle, to the moderate, say a patch of tree size, and occasionally can be very widespread. Think of landscape scale bark beetle epidemics. So while they're small in size, insects and diseases influence species composition, forest structure, and ecosystem functions. For example, insects and diseases tend to be host specific, where they attack susceptible hosts, leaving non-susceptible hosts on the site. Some prefer to attack only larger trees. Others are found mainly in regeneration or only in trees weakened by other stressors. So the forest that we see today has formed in large part due to interactions between tree hosts and their insects and diseases. Where these insects and diseases act to kill trees, they create canopy gaps, snags, and downwoody debris, which in turn provide wildlife habitat and pockets of biodiversity, as Steve was mentioning. Mortality from insects and diseases also has been shown to affect groundwater, stream flow, and carbon storage. So with that brief introduction, let's talk about some specific diseases and insects influencing the forest health in the Clackamas watershed. Of course, I'm a pathologist, so we have to start with the disease. And arguably the most important group of forest diseases are the root diseases. Root diseases are caused by fungi that live underground and attack and kill tree roots, which limits the tree's ability to take up water and nutrients, thereby weakening the tree. Root diseases have long-term impacts on the forest ecosystems where they reside due to their longevity on site. Once established on a site, these organisms are essentially permanent. They survive in buried roots and stumps from generation to generation of trees, regardless of fire, harvest, or other disturbances, and can be thousands of years old. I hope you guys have all heard of the humongous fungus in Eastern Oregon. Well, that's one of our important root diseases, armillaria. So by killing susceptible trees of all sizes and ages, slowing tree growth, and predisposing trees to other mortality agents, root diseases act to alter forest composition and structure, ecosystem function, and decrease carbon storage. At the same time, root diseases are acting to create biodiversity and wildlife habitat by creating canopy gaps, snags, and downwood. Root diseases are very widespread in West Side forests. Surveys have estimated that approximately 9% and up to 16% of Douglas fir forests in Western Oregon are occupied by root disease centers in which 50% or more of the Douglas fir have been killed. Root diseases also impact productivity due to growth losses in addition to mortality. And region-wide estimates are pretty challenging to come by, and they are very variable. But estimates of annual losses in Western Oregon and Washington are approximately 83 million cubic feet per year. So that's on the west side. In all of Oregon and Washington, mortality due to root diseases was estimated at 132 million cubic feet per year, including 51 million cubic feet per year on Forest Service lands. And finally, the National Insect and Disease Risk Map predicts that approximately 2.8 million acres in Oregon and Washington are at risk of losing 50% or more of their total basal area over the next 15-year period. So here's just the output of the National Insect and Disease Risk Map showing root disease risk modeled for the Mount Hood National Forest. The warmer colors are predicting higher levels of mortality of the root disease hosts. So you can see from where Mount Hood is there, kind of in the middle, the Clackamas Basin does have high predicted mortality, at least in some areas. But again, this is just a model. And to keep in mind, on the west side here, we only modeled one of our major root diseases, laminated root rot, even though we do have the presence of other root diseases affecting and killing trees. Because root diseases typically cause a slow decline and death of the host, and the fungi survive on site for decades, damage from root diseases is chronic and develops over long periods. And changes in damage from year to year are not easily detected or mapped, and are often overshadowed by more acute agents such as bark beetles, which tend to turn trees into flashy red trees or bright orange or being very visible. And you can see from that image on the lower left there, that's more typical crown symptoms that we see from root disease. So it's kind of a gradual fading, a slow death over time. But you can imagine that doesn't really catch your eye as you're driving by or perhaps flying by. So as a result of that, that means that root diseases are really difficult to map. And we're left with these kind of not super useful maps that I've shown up for 4 of our major root diseases. You can see there that Clackamas County in every case is red, which indicates that the disease is present and having negative effects on forest management in that county. So you can imagine that's not super useful. It'd be much better if they were able to be detected by aerial detection surveys. Since it's not feasible for us to step foot on every acre, we rely on the aerial detection survey to know what is happening across the landscape. The annual aerial detection survey is flown cooperatively between Forest Health Protection and the states, Washington DNR and Oregon Department of Forestry. It covers all forested lands, excluding urban and agricultural areas and the juniper woodlands. The survey has been flown annually since 1947, with the notable exception of 2020. And the flights consist of 2 observers traveling at about 100 miles an hour, approximately 1,500 feet above the ground level. And each observer is looking out their window on opposite sides of the plane, looking out 2 miles. So you can imagine that the observers are picking up on obvious damage. Think those red trees. And they're very unlikely to see kind of that low, slow fading out that we'll see from things like root diseases. The data collected from these annual surveys are made available online and are widely used by forest managers. You can see there on the lower right, those are the flight lines from Oregon. And so you can see the areas, which are the forested areas that have been surveyed. Yeah, we are hoping to they're going to be able to get up in the plane this year. The aerial survey results in maps like this one, mapping bear damage in the Clackamas River Watershed from 2010 to 2019. Each of those red polygons depicted on the map represents an area where the aerial detection survey detected mortality in small Douglas fir. Not every tree within the polygon will be dead. And it's important to note that the data represent acres with mortality rather than acres of mortality. When Oregon Department of Forestry did some ground surveys to verify the aerial detection survey, they found that approximately 63% of the mortality was due to root disease. and 89% was related to a combination of both bear and root disease. Since 1955, bear damage has been mapped on an average of 614 acres per year within the watershed, with a maximum of just over 2,100 acres mapped in 2006. Now we're going to change gears a little bit and leave root disease behind and start talking about our native bark beetles. Some things that you should know about bark beetles before we get started is they're very small. So think about around the size of a grain of rice. They spend the vast majority of their lives living under the bark of trees, and it takes thousands of them in mass attack to kill mature trees. Our most common bark beetle on the west side is Douglas fir beetle. As the name suggests, this beetle attacks Douglas fir. Douglas fir beetle normally kills small groups of trees, but during outbreaks, groups of hundreds of trees dead are not uncommon. Damage due to Douglas fir beetle is greatest in dense stands of mature Douglas fir, and standing trees of less than 12 inches in diameter are rarely killed in areas west of the Cascade Crest. Douglas fir beetle normally breeds in felled, injured, wind-thrown, or diseased, especially root disease, trees. A high incidence of root disease in your host trees often can result in high background levels of beetle population. Outbreaks are often triggered by disturbances. In the coastal Doug fir region, Douglas fir beetle outbreaks usually develop as a result of extensive wind throw and subside relatively quickly. In some systems, there may be a buildup following fire. Although that's not common here, we will be monitoring Douglas fir in and around the Riverside fire. Losses can be devastating during periodic outbreaks, although we haven't experienced one in our area for quite a while. In 1953 and 54, Douglas fir beetle related mortality was detected on over 140,000 acres in the Clackamas River Watershed. And you'll see I left that off the graph so it would all fit to scale. So I left off 53 and 54. The map here depicts areas with Douglas fir beetle related mortality within the basin over the 10-year period from 2010 to 2019. Since 1948, an average of 7,700 acres with Douglas fir beetle related mortality had been mapped every year within the watershed. Although the graph depicting acres of Douglas fir beetle in the watershed shows there's quite a bit of variability from year to year. Levels have been relatively low in recent years, although there are quite a few polygons showing up there on the map in the last 10 years. Our next bark beetle is called the Fur Engraver. It's found throughout Oregon and Washington. On the west side, the hosts are primarily grand fir and subalpine fir and other true firs follow. Fur engraver activity is strongly associated with root disease, drought, and defoliation. And fur engraver epidemics often occur during and following periods of prolonged drought. Adult beetles attack standing green trees that are pole-sized and larger, causing mortality, top kill, and branch dieback. During outbreaks, significant mortality may occur over large areas. So the map depicts here the areas with fur engraver related mortality from 2010 to 2019. And over the course of the annual surveys, since 1952, an average of 274 acres within the watershed have some level of fur engraver related mortality annually. And finally, let's wrap up with mountain pine beetle. Mountain pine beetle is a native insect, again, to Western North America, and it develops only in pines. But in our area, that includes lodgepole, ponderosa, western white, sugar, and white bark pines. During low population periods, early stages of an outbreak, attacks are primarily seen in trees under stress from injury, or site conditions, overcrowding, root disease, or old age. However, as beetle populations increase, attacks may involve most of the trees of a suitable size within the outbreak area, irrespective of their apparent health. The mountain pine beetle has been active in the Clackamas River watershed. The recent outbreak in the mid to late 2000s occurred in lodgepole pine near Olali and Tempe Lake. 1963 is the year with the greatest recorded damage in the watershed from aerial detection surveys at 36,000 acres. At that time, the mortality was occurring primarily in western white pine, which brings us to our next disturbance agent. Well, they warned you that I'm a pathologist, so of course I had to throw another disease in here. And this one's a little bit different because it is finally a non-native organism. So this fungus that causes white pine blister rust was introduced to Western North America in the early 1900s. It spread throughout the range of Western white pine and sugar pine in Oregon and Washington by 1940. The fungus causes girdling cankers on 5-needled pines, such as Western white pine, sugar pine, and whitebark pine. Those cankers are able to rapidly kill small trees and cause top kill of large trees, which reduces cone production. The combination of white pine blister rust and bark beetle mortality and the subsequent salvage harvest largely removed Western white pine from the landscape, which had broad ecological impacts. The overall effect of white pine blister rust has been to reduce the diversity of tree species present in many native stands and reduce populations of Western white pine and sugar pine in Oregon and Washington. And finally, our last insect is Balsam woolly Adelgid. This is another non-native that was introduced from Europe around 1900 and got to the Willamette Valley by around 1930. It's a small sucking insect that can infest all species of true firs, but subalpine fir is the most susceptible, followed by Pacific silver fir and grand fir. Trees of these species are frequently killed by heavy or prolonged infestations. Injury results from insects feeding on the host, where they inject a substance into the bark that causes abnormal cell division. On twigs and branches, cell division results in gouting. As you can see in that picture on the left, below the arrow there, that swelling, that's what we mean by gouting. On the stem, if you look at the middle picture there, each of those white woolly tufts in the middle are the balsam woolly Adelgids. So on the stem, that cell division disrupts water conduction to the crown. Chronic feeding progressively weakens the trees, predisposing them to mortality from other agents, reduces cone production, and causes deformity and mortality. As it initially spread throughout the Pacific Northwest, balsam woolly Adelgid caused extensive mortality of subalpine, grand, and Pacific silver firs during the late 1950s and 60s. Within the Clackamas River Watershed, aerial detection surveys has mapped an average of 3,300 acres with balsam woolly Adelgid damage annually. So let's talk a little bit about how climate change may impact the roles of insects and diseases in our forests. Most diseases and insects are strongly influenced by environmental conditions, and climate change will affect both the pathogen or insect and its hosts, and of course the interaction between them, which is going to result in changes in disease and insect impacts. Climate change could have positive, negative, or neutral impacts on individual diseases and insects. For example, ranges may expand, as John showed, we're going to have longer growing seasons at high elevation, maybe things will move up. Or they may contract, maybe it'll be too hot and dry at lower elevations, or both. Pathogens and insects that typically attack water-stressed hosts are likely to have increased impact in forests with reduced precipitation. The roles of insects and pathogens as disturbance agents will probably increase because their ability to adapt to new climates will be greater than that of their long-lived hosts. Most pathogens and insects will be able to migrate to locations where the climate is suitable for their survival and reproduction at a faster rate than the tree species they infest. So climate change will affect life cycles and biological synchrony between tree hosts and their pathogens and insects in unknown ways. But we have some general guesses as how this is going to play out. But there are really a lot of variability between the specific pest-host interactions and even regions where they occur. So these are just kind of some general thoughts on climate and forest diseases and insects. For the root diseases, some are related to tree stress, others are more damaging on drier sites. So we would expect increases in the amount and severity of root disease on the landscape. For the bark beetles, we may see some range expansion and potentially contraction. But we also believe that the host defenses will be weakened by hotter and drier climates. So the host will be not as able to fight off the bark beetle attacks. For insect defoliators, we think that increased temperatures will facilitate population growth, and allow greater survival. So we'll get reach expansion. Cankers are typically most damaging in trees weakened by heat and drought. So we can expect more interaction with cankers in the future. Sap-sucking insects, we expect that we'll see some increased overwintering survival due to warmer temperatures in winter and faster development rates, which means they could be having a larger impact in the future. And finally, foliage diseases. Increases in precipitation and minimum temperatures, plus the potential for greater overwinter survival, favor increased severity of foliage diseases. And one of the very first places we see foliage diseases on the landscape are where trees are maladapted to their sites. And it seems likely, or at least reasonable, to think that many of our trees will become maladapted to the sites they currently occupy. So some are calling the current conditions the rise of the secondaries, which might sound ominous, but it just means that we're seeing a lot of mortality on the landscape not related to the major insects and diseases I've introduced you to. Instead, we're seeing insects and diseases that are normally minor and not tree killers being involved. For example, in Douglas fir, we're seeing a lot of top kill, excuse me, and branch dieback reported and observed in the forest in the recent years. This dieback is associated with fungal cankers and secondary bark beetles like the Douglas Fir Engraver and the Doug fir pole beetle, which are often related to stress, such as drought and temperature extremes. For example, to just give you an example here, the amount of Douglas Fir Engraver damage mapped in 2019 was at the highest level ever recorded in Washington state, dating back to 1969 in the aerial survey. We've also been noting quite a bit of mortality in Western hemlock across all size and age classes. The foliage does not flash out red in 1 year, so this mortality is very challenging to detect in aerial detection surveys. It's also pretty easy to overlook at the general forest. The symptoms include a gradual crown dieback or loss of foliage, yellowing or browning of the crowns, and some trees even die within a year of the first noticeable symptoms developing. Forest health protection offices and state forest health agencies have been reporting increased calls and reports of western red cedar dieback, and such to the point that the western red cedar mortality code was just added to the aerial detection survey in 2017. Since western red cedar dieback was added to the aerial detection survey, there's been a steady increase in mortality every year, with approximately 43,000 acres of damage and 100,000 trees mapped in Washington in 2019. This is likely an underrepresentation of the mortality that has occurred because the transparent crowns can be difficult to see from the air. Scientists from Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia are collaborating to examine the extent, patterns, and causes of this dieback. But some things that we know, or we think we know, are that western hemlock and western red cedar are among the least drought-tolerant species in the Pacific Northwest. Looking into the role of drought and high temperatures, both western red hemlock and western red cedar tend to be fairly shallowly rooted, which may make them vulnerable to fluctuating water tables and result in the loss of fine roots, thereby weakening trees. The roles of insects and diseases in this dieback remain unclear. Western red cedar is fairly resistant to most insects and diseases, while western hemlock is pretty susceptible to most, or many at any rate. But so far, we aren't seeing any consistent evidence of our major tree-killing insects and diseases. Instead, secondary organisms that don't typically kill trees are being found. The bottom line is we need more data, and surveys are being conducted to tease out those relationships. So to wrap things up, diseases and insects in the Clackamas River Watershed are always at work, whether you see them or not. They operate at various time scales, from days to centuries, and spatial scales, from the needle to the landscape. And finally, insects and diseases play a large role in determining forest composition, structure, and function. So keep your eyes out and check out all the cool things the diseases and insects are doing out there. And that is all I have.
All right, thank you, Holly. And I don't see any questions right now, but I have a quick question. In terms of the bark beetles, of course, which often the kind of the major, one of the major causes of death. You noted that back in the 50s, there was a pretty large acreage, over 100,000 acres. What role would the fires have? And, what are you expecting to see after the Riverside fire, particularly in the Clackamas, in terms of increasing that sort of background level of bark beetles, as well as just threats, to the, trees that are surviving out there, but surrounded by beetle food?
Well, as I mentioned, Douglas fir beetle is our #1 beetle in the watershed, and we haven't seen a real response from that after fire here on the west side. But in fact, we were after the 36 pit fire. My colleague, Beth Wilhite, who's an entomologist, so she's actually the specialist on this, they wanted to kill more trees after that fire. So they were actually did a little study where she tried to draw the bark beetles into the Douglas fir surrounding the 36 pit fire to try to create more snags on the landscape. So there was some hope right after the fire that the Doug fir beetle would respond and come in and create some snags on its own, but that didn't happen. So I think we will definitely be keeping our eyes out. I think we are not, there's a lot of variables involved, but we're not thinking that we're going to see a huge uptick in Doug fir beetle right away, but we will definitely be keeping our eyes out.
All right. Well, I think many of your neighbors might think that's a good thing.
And Beth may have something different to say about that. But
yeah. Well, we're getting a lot of questions about how much we have to worry about that in Douglas fir, because it could be a different story in pines, for example. Okay. I think at this point we can open up to questions for anybody. We're just getting close to 8 o'clock here. But I'd just like to offer more opportunity for questions for any of our speakers. One that you didn't mention with big leaf maple, we've seen a fair amount of kind of scattered maple dieback. Of course, maple is a pretty important tree, especially lower down in the watershed. I thought I'd heard Beth Wilhite say that she had some ideas about what's killing the big leaf maples that are dying back.
Yes, Beth has been doing some really amazing work with big leaf maples. She has attempted to detect the insects that are out there by putting out sticky cards. And she's found her first discovery was that many of the leaves of the big leaf maple that we were finding on the ground prematurely shed had cast skins from a leaf hopper. So she went about studying it and found that there really is, in fact, quite a bit of leaf hopper damage in these upper leaves. I think, boy, I hate to get all the details messed up, but I think that the reason we see a lot of damage in the upper crowns is because they like the sun and that warmer weather. So I believe she thinks that some of the climate change, warmer, hotter conditions that we've been having has led to an increase in the leaf hopper. And that is leading to some of the decline we've seen. We've done, the pathologists at the Washington State Department of Natural Resources have done numerous surveys of big leaf maple in Western Washington, trying to track down the causes of these declines, and have not been able to attribute it to a single cause. So we think it's a bunch of things are involved, but definitely the leaf hoppers are playing a role.
All right. Thank you. I see a question from David. Is there a good reference for further reading for the general public to explore the range of effects of climate change on forests, and including changes in temperature, et cetera, precipitation, insects? So I guess that would be for any of our presenters, if you know of a good reference to look at the range of effects of climate change on forests.
I could address a part of that anyway. One answer. If you Google adaptation partners, you should arrive at a website called adaptationpartners.org, and it represents a lot of climate change vulnerability assessment work that has been led by the Forest Service, but it is actually a very collaborative project that includes partner federal agencies, state agencies, Native American tribes, and other NGOs and et cetera. And there are reports there that are organized around different groups of national forests that deal with, they tend to summarize climate change projections and then some of the projected impacts on forests and some of the adaptation approaches that are possible. It may be a little bit technical, so I have to warn you about that. For general climate change literature, I think that if you go to OCRI, Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, I think it's if you Google that, with Oregon State University, it's run by OSU, and they have a number of publications that address climate change, including Oregon Climate Assessment Report, which I think is very readable. And then for global issues, there's, if you Google IPCC report, they publish these massive reports, but I could direct you to the executive summaries, which are actually quite readable and easy to digest.
Okay. And that first one you mentioned, that was Adaptation Partners.
That's correct.
Okay, yeah, and the climate vulnerability assessments, et cetera. Well, very good. We're right at the end of time, but if there's more questions, we'll entertain those for a little longer. Just to wrap up announcements, that our next session in the Journey Down the Clackamas is in 2 weeks, July 27th. That'll be the second forestry session about the riparian forest conditions and importance of riparian forests in the Clackamas. That'll be John Souter and myself, actually, from OSU. And just you'll be getting a thank you email, and you'll get links for upcoming events and about the continuing education credits. I really want to thank Peck, Steve, and Holly, and John, all of you for putting this together tonight. And I want to thank our sponsors again, our gold sponsor, Clackamas Water Environment Services, Geological Society of Oregon Country, and the Clackamas River Water Providers. So thanks everyone for coming tonight. And it's my pleasure to take part here and host. And with that, we're at 8 o'clock, but if there's any more questions for our speakers, we might entertain a few more. And I know it's been a long night, but it was really fascinating for me. So thanks you all for hanging in there. And again, really thank all of our speakers. Well, everyone, I don't see any more questions. So I think we'll call it a night. And tell your friends about the recording who missed it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yes,